Golden light filled the grand ballroom, soft and warm, like a dream painted on polished marble floors. The sound of laughter and glasses clinking echoed through the air. Everyone was dressed in glittering clothes. The smell of food and perfume mixed into the air like music. It was one of those nights that looked perfect from the outside, when no one imagined pain could exist behind a smile. Guests moved between tables, smiling, toasting, and laughing. A famous pianist had played earlier, but now the piano stood quietly at the far corner, covered with a thin layer of dust that no one noticed. People were too busy living their perfect moments. They were talking about business, love, and plans for vacations. No one paid attention to the quiet waitress moving between them, carrying trays that were heavier than they looked. Clara, the waitress, moved carefully, her white shirt slightly wrinkled from hours of work. Her hands smelled faintly of soap and lemon from the kitchen. She smiled politely at the guests, but her eyes never reached theirs. She had learned long ago that people didn't really see waitresses. They only saw the food in their hands. Still, she worked quickly and quietly. She had been trained not to make a sound, not to break the illusion of joy that surrounded the wealthy people in front of her. Every time she passed near the piano, she slowed down just a little. Her eyes flicked toward it just for a second, like a secret she couldn't forget. She used to play once long ago. Her father had taught her. They didn't have much, but their small apartment had an old, upright piano that sat near the window. She would play while her father sat on the couch, humming softly. Those were simple days, and she had loved them. But that piano was gone now, sold to pay for hospital bills. Her father gone too. The dream buried with him. Someone laughed loudly across the room, snapping her out of her thoughts. She tightened her grip on the tray and turned away, her back straight, pretending the music in her memory didn't ache in her chest. She served drinks to a group of businessmen who never looked at her face. They only saw the glasses, and when one of them spilled wine, they looked annoyed as if she had ruined their night. She apologized softly, even though it wasn't her fault. The clock struck 11, and the lights dimmed slightly to a golden glow, signaling the last hour of the party. Couples danced lazily. The band had packed up and laughter grew tired. Clara looked at the piano again. It was a grand instrument, black, polished, beautiful. She could see her faint reflection in it. Her eyes looked older than her age. She wondered how it would feel to touch the keys again, to hear real music fill the hall instead of empty noise. In the far corner, the hotel manager whispered to a chef, pointing at a tablecloth that needed straightening. Clara hurried over, fixed it, and nodded silently. She never complained. Her shoes hurt, her back ached, and her throat was dry. But she didn't stop. Work meant survival, and she couldn't afford mistakes. Not tonight. Outside, a light drizzle began to fall against the tall glass windows, raindrops running down like small rivers of silver. Inside, people didn't notice. They were still laughing, still shining in their expensive clothes. Clara stood near the piano again as she waited for her next order. Her fingers brushed against the smooth wood by accident. A chill ran through her hand. It was like touching a memory. She looked around. No one noticed her. Everyone was busy. She wanted to lift the piano cover just once to press a single key, but she didn't. Not yet. She knew her place. Invisible. Unheard. Unseen. But deep inside her, a quiet voice whispered that she didn't belong in the shadows forever. The band's last note echoed faintly, followed by claps and fading laughter. One by one, the guests began leaving, taking their warmth and perfume with them. The room started to grow colder, emptier. She exhaled slowly, placing the last tray back in the kitchen, then turned toward the piano again. The hall was quiet now. Chairs were empty, candles dying slowly. She felt the kind of silence that only comes after too much noise, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about her bills, her tired feet, or her empty apartment. She was thinking about sound, about the way the piano once made her feel alive. She stood still in that golden emptiness, surrounded by laughter that had already left, and in that lonely glow, something deep inside her began to awaken again, like a song waiting to be remembered. The last guest's laughter faded into the night as the doors closed behind them. leaving only silence. The chandeliers hummed softly above, their light flickering like tired stars. Clara stood among half-empty glasses and crumpled napkins, holding her tray close to her chest, her body sore but her mind restless. The echo of the evening still floated in her ears. Laughter, chatter, clinking. All the things that made her feel small, invisible, and far away from who she once was. She walked slowly between the tables, collecting what the night had left behind. Pieces of celebration scattered across polished marble. A half-eaten dessert, lipstick on a glass, perfume still lingering in the air. She cleaned quietly, her every step measured, careful not to break the fragile peace that had settled over the hall. Outside, rain whispered against the tall windows, a calm rhythm that somehow matched the beating of her heart. In the corner of the hall stood the piano, tall, elegant, and almost glowing under the dim light. Clara paused, her breath catching for a second. She didn't know why, but her hands trembled slightly as she looked at it. Maybe because it reminded her of her father, or maybe because deep inside it reminded her of the person she used to be, the one who dreamed of playing on stages like this, before life decided otherwise. When she was a little girl, her father used to call her his little Melody. He worked nights fixing streetlights, but every morning before she went to school, he'd sit by her side while she practiced. He never learned to read music, but he'd hum along, off-key but happy. Those mornings were her favorite memories. The world back then felt small, kind, and full of hope. But after he got sick, everything changed. The music stopped, the piano sold, and silence took its place. Clara placed the tray on a nearby table and moved closer to the piano. She hesitated, glancing at the doorway to make sure no one was watching. The manager had gone. The chefs were cleaning up in the kitchen. She was alone. She ran her hand over the smooth surface of the instrument. It felt warm beneath her fingertips, like something alive. For years she had served people who never looked her in the eyes, people who talked about music and art but never knew what it truly meant to lose it. Yet tonight, in this empty hall, she felt something inside her stirring again, a quiet ache that whispered, "Play." She looked at her reflection on the black surface, her uniform wrinkled, hair slightly messy, dark circles under her eyes. She almost laughed at herself. What would they think if they saw the waitress playing their piano? She murmured softly. The thought scared her and comforted her all at once. She sat down carefully on the bench, her hands hovering over the keys but not pressing yet. It had been years, maybe 10, maybe more, since she had touched a real piano. Her mind told her to stand up, to go back to work. But her heart refused. She pressed one key. A soft, trembling note filled the air, and it felt like the world stopped breathing for a second. The sound echoed through the hall, blending with the rain outside. She closed her eyes and pressed another, then another. Her fingers stumbled at first, clumsy, unsure, but then they found their rhythm. The melody came slowly, fragile like a memory trying to be remembered. It wasn't perfect, her timing off, her hands shaking, but it was real, and it was hers. The notes told her story without words, the years of silence, the nights of exhaustion, the grief she buried beneath polite smiles. It all poured out through the piano. She played the lullaby her father used to hum, soft and broken, but filled with love, the kind that hurts and heals at the same time. She didn't notice that a few people had lingered outside the hall, a couple waiting for their driver, a guard doing his final round. They heard the faint melody drifting through the half-open door, haunting and beautiful, the kind of sound that made people stop mid-step and listen. Clara's fingers moved faster now, stronger, her body swaying slightly with each note. The music carried her somewhere far beyond that empty ballroom, into a world where she wasn't a waitress, where she wasn't forgotten. She was once again the girl with dreams in her eyes and her father's love in her heart. When the final note faded, she stayed still, hands resting on the keys, eyes wet with tears she hadn't realized had fallen. The hall was silent again, but it was no longer empty. It had heard something true, something real. And for the first time in years, Clara smiled. a quiet, fragile smile. Because even though no one had applauded, no one had cheered, she had given life back to something she thought was lost forever. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and whispered to the piano, "Thank you," before turning away, not knowing that a few people outside had already filmed her without her noticing, that the melody she thought no one would hear was about to travel far beyond that lonely night and change everything that came after. The next morning came softly, with sunlight spilling through the curtains of Clara's small apartment. She woke up to the sound of rain fading into quiet drips on her window. Her body ached from the long night, but her mind was still lost somewhere between music and memory. She sat on her narrow bed, staring at her hands, the same hands that had once played with confidence, now trembling slightly as if they still remembered the keys. She didn't plan to think about it, but the sound of her own playing wouldn't leave her. It echoed in her mind, gentle, haunting, alive. She had never meant to touch the piano last night, never meant to break the silence she'd built for years, yet something had pulled her, something stronger than fear. At work, everything felt the same. The clatter of dishes, the hiss of coffee machines, and the soft hum of guests chatting over breakfast. Clara moved among them quietly, her apron tied tightly, her hair pinned back neatly. No one looked at her twice, and that was how she liked it. Or at least, how she had convinced herself she did, but inside she felt changed, a tiny spark glowing under layers of tiredness and routine. Around noon, the hotel manager called her into his office. His face unreadable, Clara's heart sank. She thought maybe she'd been caught, that someone had seen her touch the piano and now she'd lose her job. She stepped inside slowly, her palms cold. "Clara," he said, tapping his desk. "You played the piano last night, didn't you?" She froze, her voice caught in her throat. She tried to deny it, but he continued before she could speak. "Someone recorded it." Her stomach dropped. She imagined herself being fired, her rent unpaid, her future slipping away. But then the manager turned his screen toward her. The video was playing, shaky camera footage, the hall dimly lit, her silhouette at the piano, fingers moving like shadows on ivory, the melody echoing through the phone speaker. The sound was imperfect yet filled with emotion, and below it hundreds of comments flooded in. People writing, "Who is she?" This moved me to tears. The Waitress plays better than most concert pianists. It had gone viral overnight. The clip had been shared across social media. Newspapers were already trying to find out who she was. Clara stared at the screen in disbelief, her throat tightening. "Is this real?" she whispered. The manager smiled awkwardly, half proud, half confused. "Apparently, yes. The world seems to love you," he said. "They're calling you the pianist in the dark." For the first time in years, Clara didn't know what to say. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed, grateful, and afraid all at once. She had lived invisible for so long that being seen suddenly felt like standing under a spotlight she hadn't asked for. After her shift ended, she stepped outside. The city felt different. The air buzzed, her phone, an old cracked model, lit up with dozens of notifications. Strangers asking for interviews, a music academy inviting her to visit, and messages from people saying her song had made them cry. She scrolled slowly, her eyes wet, realizing that something she had done for herself, in a moment of pain and loneliness, had somehow touched thousands later that evening. She sat again in the ballroom, now empty, the same piano waiting quietly in the corner. She touched it again, but this time she didn't feel fear. She felt peace. She closed her eyes and began to play. The same melody, but softer, slower, each note like a whisper between her and her father's memory. Behind her, the door opened quietly. A man in a dark suit stood watching, the hotel owner himself. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he spoke gently. "Clara, that song you played, it reminded me of someone I lost too." His voice trembled slightly. "You have something rare, don't let it die again," he said, offering her something unexpected. Permission to play for the guests. Not as a waitress, but as the pianist of the hotel. Clara stared at him, shocked. Her lips parted, but no words came. Tears gathered again. She nodded slowly, unable to believe what she'd just heard. She spent the next few nights practicing after her shifts, rediscovering songs she once loved. Her fingers regaining confidence, the music becoming her language again. And though she still lived in her small apartment, nothing felt the same anymore. People began to visit the hotel not for its food or parties, but to hear her, the quiet waitress who played the piano in the dark. Each night when she sat down to play, the crowd fell silent, and the same melody that once came from her loneliness now filled the room with hope. Clara had no idea what the future held, but she no longer felt invisible. She had found her voice again, and the world, somehow, had paused to listen. The night was calm again, the rain gone, replaced by a still silence that hung over the city like a sigh. Inside the hotel ballroom, the chandeliers glimmered softly, their golden reflections dancing across the polished floor. It was the same room, yet somehow it felt different now. The air itself seemed to hum with quiet anticipation. Clara stood near the entrance, no longer dressed as a waitress but in a simple, elegant black dress that the hotel owner had insisted she wear for her first performance. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief that this was really happening. Just a week ago, she had been invisible, a background figure serving others' dreams. Now the same guests who once never looked at her were seated and waiting, murmuring with curiosity. Phones ready? Whispering about the pianist in the dark. Clara didn't know whether to feel proud or terrified. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, each beat echoing the question that haunted her. Am I really ready for this? Behind the curtains, she took a deep breath. The faint scent of roses and wine filled the air. She thought of her father then, of the way he would smile at her mistakes and say, "The piano doesn't care about perfection. It only cares about honesty." Those words grounded her, reminded her why she was here. This wasn't about fame or viral videos, it was about the music, about speaking the truth she couldn't say in words. The announcer's voice echoed across the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a special guest, the young woman whose music has touched hearts around the world. Please welcome Clara." Applause rose softly. Polite and expectant, Clara stepped out from behind the curtain. Her step slow, her breath shaky. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. She sat at the piano, her fingers hovering just above the keys for a moment. The weight of all those eyes pressed down on her. But then when her fingers touched the first note, the fear melted away. The sound was pure and fragile. Like morning sunlight breaking through mist, she began to play slowly at first, her melody weaving through the silence like a story being told for the first time. The song she chose was one she had written years ago. Hidden in an old notebook, it had no name, just a melody that carried her childhood, her father's laughter, her mother's absence, and her own fight to survive as she played. Her emotions spilled through her fingertips. Sorrow, love, hope, and forgiveness blending together into something that made the room still. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the waiters froze in quiet awe. The music wasn't loud or complex, but it carried something real. Something everyone in that room recognized, even if they couldn't explain it. It was the sound of pain transformed into beauty, of loss turned into light. A few guests began to cry quietly. Others closed their eyes, letting the melody take them somewhere else, somewhere far from the noise of their lives. Clara didn't see them, she was lost inside the song. Every note she played felt like breathing again after years underwater. When the final chord faded into silence, the room stayed still for several long seconds, then came the sound. Soft, trembling applause that grew louder and louder until it filled the entire hall. Clara stood and bowed her head, tears glimmering in her eyes. She didn't feel like a star or a celebrity. She just felt seen, for the first time in forever afterward. People came up to her, and strangers, guests, even staff, thanking her, telling her how her music made them remember something they had lost. One old man with kind eyes said, "I haven't cried in 20 years. Until tonight," and she smiled, because she understood exactly what he meant later. When the crowd had left and the lights dimmed, Clara stayed behind again, just like that first night. The piano before her and the silence around her. She sat down once more, alone now, and whispered, "We did it, Dad," her voice breaking softly. She played one more song, just for herself, no cameras, no audience, only the ghosts of her past listening in the dark. Outside, the city glowed faintly, the video of her performance already spreading again. Millions would see it by morning, but for Clara, the greatest moment had already passed. It wasn't the applause or the fame. It was that one moment when her hands touched the keys, and she realized she was no longer the forgotten waitress in the corner. She was Clara again, the girl her father had always believed she would become. The days that followed her first performance moved like a dream. Every hour filled with something new, something impossible. Clara still found herself waking before dawn, still boiling her morning tea in the small kettle that hissed unevenly. But when she looked at her phone now, it wasn't filled with overdue bills. It was filled with messages, calls, and invitations. People from all over the city wanted to meet the pianist in the dark. She had played only one official performance, but it had changed everything. Her video reached millions of views online. A famous radio host talked about her on air, saying her music made people feel something they'd forgotten they could feel. The hotel had become a quiet attraction now. Guests came not just to stay, but to listen. Still, Clara's heart wasn't chasing fame every night when she sat at the piano. She remembered the silence of that first night, the moment when it was just her and the keys. No applause, no expectations, only honesty. She promised herself she would never lose that, even if the world around her changed one evening. As she prepared for another performance, a tall woman entered the hall. She wore a gray coat and carried an air of quiet authority. When Clara approached, the woman smiled and introduced herself as Marianne Dale, a director from the National Conservatory. Clara blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Marianne explained that she had been following Clara's story and wanted to offer her something, a place at the conservatory, not as a student but as a performer and mentor, to inspire others who had lost their way. Clara stood frozen, the words sinking slowly into her chest. She had always thought her chance at music education was gone forever, that she'd buried that part of her life years ago, but now someone wanted her to teach, to guide others. Her eyes glistened, and all she could whisper was, "Why me?" The director smiled softly. "Because your music reminds people that broken things can still be beautiful." That night, Clara played differently. The hall was full, yet she didn't feel nervous. She felt alive. Her fingers glided over the piano, weaving melodies that carried both her past and her future. She didn't perform for applause. She played for her father, for the little girl who had once dreamed by the window of a small apartment, for everyone who had ever been told it was too late to start again. When the concert ended, the crowd rose to their feet. The applause thundered through the room like a heartbeat. Clara bowed her head, but her smile was humble, soft, and real. As she stepped backstage, a young waitress approached her shyly. Holding a napkin for an autograph, Clara saw herself in the girl. The same tired eyes, the same quiet hope. She smiled and wrote, "Keep listening to your heart. It never forgets the way home." Later, when the hall emptied and the lights dimmed again, she stayed behind as always. She sat alone at the piano, the golden reflection of the chandelier shimmering on the keys. She began to play a gentle tune, one she had never shared before. It was unfinished, just like her story, but it was full of promise. Outside, the city lights blinked in rhythm, her music drifting through the open doors, carried away into the night. People passing by paused, drawn by the sound coming from inside. And for a moment, strangers stopped, listened, and smiled. Clara didn't know it yet, but her name was about to travel far beyond the city. She would soon be invited to play at charity events, to speak about hope, to record her first album. Yet she never forgot where it all began. A quiet night, a dusty piano, and the courage to touch a key when no one was watching. Her journey had started in darkness, but now, every note she played carried light, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been left unseen. And though the world now called her the pianist in the dark, Clara finally understood the truth. She was never really playing in darkness at all. She had only been finding her way back to the light. The next few weeks unfolded like a sunrise, slow, warm, and full of color. Every day brought something new to Clara's once quiet life. She had become a name people whispered about, not as gossip but as inspiration. Strangers sent her letters saying her music helped them heal. Mothers said their children had started learning piano after hearing her story. Every message touched her heart, reminding her that her pain had turned into someone else's hope. Still, Clara didn't let fame change her routine. She woke early, brewed her tea, tied her hair back, and walked through the city to the hotel where it all began. The staff greeted her differently now, not as the waitress, but as Miss Clara, the pianist, yet she never stopped smiling at them, never stopped thanking the kitchen workers who once stood beside her during long, hard nights. She knew how it felt to be invisible, and she wanted no one else to feel that way again. One afternoon, the hotel owner called her into the ballroom, where a group of men in suits stood waiting beside cameras and equipment. He told her a documentary crew wanted to film a special episode about her life. "Your story has given people hope," the director said. "We want to show the world who you really are," Clara agreed, though part of her still felt nervous about being seen so completely. They filmed her while she played, asking her questions between songs. One of them asked softly, "Clara, what did you think about the night you first played here? alone in the dark. She paused, her eyes drifting toward the piano. "I didn't think," she said quietly. "I just felt like something inside me was asking to breathe again." The crew fell silent, capturing her words like a secret. That night, after the crew left, Clara sat alone once more. The lights dimmed, and the ballroom returned to its soft golden silence, the same kind of silence that had once frightened her. But now it felt like home. She touched the keys gently and began to play, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but for the shadows, for her father, for that version of herself who had been lost in the noise of survival. The melody that came out was new, deeper, wiser, and full of emotion. It carried gratitude and peace, pain and love, everything she had learned in these past months outside. People passing by stopped at the windows again, watching the woman in the black dress play like she was talking to the stars. The documentary aired a few days later, and the world fell in love all over again. News channels called her the heart that healed through harmony. Donations poured in for the charity she had quietly started, a foundation to provide free music lessons to children from struggling families. "Every child deserves a piano key to hope," she said during one interview, her eyes shining with quiet determination. But behind the calm smile, Clara carried a truth she rarely spoke of every time she played. She still felt that empty chair beside her, the one where her father used to sit, humming off key. And though it hurt, that ache had become her strength. It reminded her why she played, and not to be perfect, but to be real. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, the hotel received a letter. It came from a man in Italy, a composer named Vittorio Romano, who had watched her story online. He wrote that her music had moved him deeply, and that he wished to collaborate. He sent a handwritten invitation to perform at the International Harmony Gala in Florence. Clara's hands shook as she read it. The thought of traveling to another country, performing for thousands, felt like a dream too big for the girl who once cleaned tables in silence. She looked at the piano in front of her, ran her hand along its smooth surface, and whispered, "We're going to Italy." It wasn't just her journey anymore. It was the piano's too. The same instrument that had once been her secret now carried her to the world. That night, she played one last time before her departure, every note a goodbye to the place where her story began. The staff gathered quietly at the back of the hall, listening with tears in their eyes when she finished. The room stayed still for a long, beautiful moment, and then came the applause. Not loud, not for fame, but filled with love. As Clara stood and looked around the ballroom, she realized something simple yet powerful. The girl who once feared the dark had become the light for others. And as she packed her music sheets later that night, she didn't feel nervous or small. She felt ready, because somewhere in the world, there were still people who hadn't found their song yet, and she intended to help them hear it, one note at a time. The plane descended through soft clouds, the Italian sunlight spilling over fields of green and gold. Clara pressed her hand against the window, her reflection trembling in the glass. She still couldn't believe she was here. Florence, the city her father used to talk about when he described the land of music, the place where great composers had once walked the streets humming melodies that changed the world. Now she, a former waitress who once played in the dark, had been invited to perform on one of its grandest stages. When she stepped out of the airport, a cool breeze brushed against her face. The air carried the scent of old stone, espresso and roses. Everything felt unreal. She was greeted by the event coordinator, a kind woman with a bright scarf and a wide smile. "Signorina Clara, the world has been waiting to hear you," she said. Hugging her warmly, Clara smiled shyly, still unused to such words. The days leading up to the performance were a whirlwind. Reporters wanted interviews, local musicians wanted to meet her, and the Grand Theater, Teatro d'Armonia, stood like a cathedral of music, its walls covered in paintings of composers, its floor glimmering under chandeliers that looked like frozen stars. The first time Clara walked onto the stage for rehearsal, she felt her knees weaken. She ran her fingers across the piano keys, and a quiet gasp escaped her lips. It was a Steinway, smooth, perfect, and alive beneath her touch. During rehearsals, Vittorio Romano, the Italian composer who had invited her, watched from the front row, an older man with kind eyes and white hair tied neatly at the back. When she finished playing, he stood slowly and clapped. "You don't play music," he said softly. "You become it." Clara blushed, lowering her gaze. I just play what I feel, she said. Exactly, he replied. And that's why people listen. But as the performance day neared, Clara began to feel something heavy inside her chest, a quiet fear she couldn't explain. One night, sitting in her hotel room, she opened the old locket she always wore. Inside was a faded photo of her and her father beside their old piano. She ran her thumb over it, whispering, "I wish you could see this, Papa." The next morning, she woke with a sense of calm, as if somewhere he had heard her. The evening of the gala arrived. The theater glowed under golden light. Thousands filled the seats. People from all over Europe had come to see the woman whose music had once silenced a ballroom. Clara stood backstage in a flowing ivory gown, her fingers trembling slightly. She heard the orchestra tuning, the murmur of the audience fading into quiet expectation. Vittorio placed a hand on her shoulder. "Remember," he said gently. "Tonight, don't play for them, play for him." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. The announcer's voice echoed through the theater, calling her name. The applause that followed was thunderous, but she barely heard it. She walked onto the stage slowly, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. She bowed, sat down, and took a deep breath. Then came the first note, soft, delicate, and trembling like a heartbeat. It echoed through the vast hall. Wrapping around the silence, she began to play, her melody weaving through the air like light through stained glass. Every note carried a memory: her father's laughter, the scent of her old apartment, the sound of rain on the window. Her hands moved with confidence now, dancing across the keys. Halfway through, she closed her eyes, letting the music carry her. The hall faded away. The audience disappeared. It was just her and her father again, sitting in their small living room, him humming off-key, her laughing, their hearts full. The final notes rose like a prayer, then fell into silence so pure it felt holy. When she opened her eyes, the audience was standing, not a single person sitting. Tears glimmered on faces, applause erupted, echoing like a heartbeat through the grand hall. Flowers rained onto the stage. Clara stood, bowing deeply, her eyes wet but shining. She didn't feel famous, she felt whole. Afterward, Vittorio approached her with misty eyes. "You gave them something they'll never forget," he said. She smiled softly. "I gave them what he gave me," she replied, that night. As she walked through the quiet streets of Florence, the stars overhead glowing faintly, she felt her father beside her, not as a ghost but as music in the wind. Every step she took echoed with peace. She had come a long way from the girl who played alone in the dark, and yet she realized that darkness had never been her enemy. It had simply been waiting for her to find her light. One note at a time, the sun was rising over Florence, painting the city in soft gold and rose. The bells of distant churches rang slowly through the cool morning air. Clara stood on the balcony of her small hotel room, still in her concert dress from the night before, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, her mind replaying the music from the gala again and again. She had played with her heart laid bare, and now, the world seemed to hum with its echo. Her phone buzzed endlessly on the nightstand. Messages from strangers, friends, reporters, even other musicians. Thousands of words of love and admiration filling the screen. But Clara didn't open them right away. She just smiled quietly, watching the sun climb higher. "We did it, Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling with peace. Later that morning, she met Vittorio Romano at a small cafe overlooking the Arno River. He greeted her with a warm hug and a proud smile. "You've done something rare, Clara," he said softly. "You reminded people that music isn't about perfection. It's about truth." She nodded, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "I don't know if I can ever play something that feels that real again." Vittorio chuckled gently. "That's the secret, my dear. You don't play real. You live it. And then it plays through you." They sat in quiet conversation, the sound of the river flowing beneath them, the world outside moving slowly. Clara realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't running, she wasn't surviving, she was living. The girl who had once scrubbed tables now sat in one of the oldest cities in the world, not because she chased fame, but because she followed the one thing that had never left her, the sound of her own soul. A week later, she returned home. The hotel where everything began had prepared something special. The owner, the same man who once saw her play in the dark, had arranged a small ceremony as she entered the ballroom. The lights dimmed and a soft video began to play. Clips of her journey, the viral night, her first performance, the gala in Italy, the audience rising to their feet, and finally, Her father's picture faded in, smiling gently. Clara pressed her hand to her heart, her eyes glistening. When the lights came back on, the owner stepped forward. "Clara," he said with emotion in his voice, "you've given this place a soul. This piano will always belong to you." Behind him, the staff revealed the grand piano, newly restored, its wood polished to perfection, and engraved in gold on the edge were the words, "For the girl who played in the dark and found the light." Clara's breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks as she touched the engraving. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice shaking, she sat at the piano again, the same one that had started it all, and began to play a new melody, one she had written on her journey home. It began softly, like a whisper, then grew into something bright and powerful. It was a song of return, of peace, of a heart healed through sound. Everyone in the room fell silent, listening as she closed her eyes and smiled. The music filled every corner, carrying warmth into the shadows that had once haunted her. When she finished, the applause was gentle but full of love. The same kitchen staff who once worked beside her clapped through tears. The janitor wiped his eyes. The hotel manager bowed his head. It was not a grand audience, but it was hers. The people who had seen her from the beginning, the ones who mattered most that evening. Clara walked out of the hotel and sat on the steps, the sky glowing orange and purple, the streets alive with laughter and life. She felt something shift quietly inside her. Not an ending, but a beginning. Her journey had turned into something bigger than herself. She wasn't just a pianist anymore. She was a reminder to others that light could be found in the darkest corners. If only they dared to touch the keys years later, people would still tell her story. The waitress who played in the dark and changed the world with her music. But Clara never thought of it that way. Whenever someone asked her what success felt like, she would simply smile and say, "It feels like forgiveness. It feels like coming home." That night, before locking the doors, she looked back at the piano one last time. The golden engraving shining softly in the dim light, she whispered, "Thank you for waiting," then turned off the lights. The hall falling silent once more, but this time, it wasn't an empty silence. It was full of echoes, full of memory, full of life. And as she stepped outside into the cool night, the faint melody of her own song followed her into the city, glowing like a heartbeat in the dark.